This is the Patchwork Suite, where a single musical theme is the common thread in a season of variations. The heart of these variations is the theme we're listening to now, a poetic waltz by Enrique Granados. I'm your Patchwork Suite host, Mary Claire Murphy, and throughout the series, I speak with composers who have graciously written a short work expressly for this podcast. I've asked each composer to draw on both the Granados theme and on a textile they find meaningful. With each new voice we hear, and with each musical sampling, we're building a colorful and diverse patchwork of artistic expression. To the patchwork, we add a square of flannel. What color of flannel? I'll leave that up to you. Maybe you like the classic red and black checkers, or maybe you want to go rogue with blue or green or even multicolor. But no matter what your go-to is when sweater weather comes around, flannel's kind of like the hot cocoa of fabrics. It's cozy to the core, comforting, nostalgic. And composer Alvin Leung tapped into those very feelings with his flannel-inspired Patchwork Suite variation. Although he's accustomed to mild winters in Hong Kong, Alvin describes how flannel still holds a corner of his heart.
Winters in Hong Kong are quite warm, but because we never experience like snow at all, so we think that's like 50 degrees is like very cold, and people would wear things like flannel. Flannel also gives like this feeling of home. I don't know where they come from, but I just imagine sitting at home and cozy in the winter.
Alvin was born and raised in Hong Kong and began learning piano at 6 years old. He attended the Chinese University of Hong Kong for undergrad and then traveled to the U.S. for a master's degree in music composition at Bowling Green State University. Having completed the master's there, he went on to the University of North Texas, where he's now completing a doctoral degree, also in music composition. His interest in the field was first piqued by a competition back in his high school years.
There is like this competition in Hong Kong called New Generation that is for this sort of very young composers, to write. And for that year is for a string quartet. So I wrote a string quartet, and I got the second prize. And what's more than that is to get the experience of actually hear your piece performed by like humans, performers. Like, oh, it sounds very, very different from MIDI.
MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface, and it's a way that various electronic devices can digitally store and communicate musical data, like a pitch, note duration, and volume, among other attributes. Through MIDI, composers can create digital mock-ups of a composition, which can be very helpful in the writing process, but for an acoustic composition, live performers give it dimension that just can't be electronically replicated. On the other hand, for a composer with advanced knowledge of music technology, computers can be instruments in their own right, yielding these incredible synthesized sound worlds that acoustic instruments couldn't replicate. Alvin takes interest in both acoustic and electroacoustic composition, but since flannel is of the latter ilk, he tells us a little more about how he got into it.
I think what drew me into also composing electroacoustic music was basically my experience at Bowling Green. I did not really have any background in electronic music when I was an undergrad, but I think Dr. Lilios had been a very inspiring teacher, and I got to know more about electroacoustic music by listening to a lot of works and just figuring out what I could do with the software, and those are really fun, and I just started liking it, and that also provided me with almost like a sandbox, like a space, the software as a space for me to be creative and think about, how can I transform it into a sound that I would never imagine.
Alvin takes us into that creative sandbox with him, to a world of wintry fractals and complex textures.
You have this sort of, variance and variety inside the texture, like a texture inside a texture, where you have roughness, you have smoothness and the coexistence and all this in betweens.
It's because of those textures that Alvin named the work flannel. Let's explore some of the filaments within that texture, and to do so, we revisit the original long and lyrical waltz theme. Now compare that to flannel, where you'll only catch a few snippets of the theme, nestled in a nebulous atmosphere. And as for the bass line, well, it doesn't always get the star role next to a shining melody. But this time, it does. Listening to the bass alone, Alvin noticed there was clay to work with there. That simple but expressive bass line takes on a life of its own as a hypnotizing gesture in flannel. You'll also notice that Alvin seasoned the material from the first section with a sprig from the contrasting material. Again, here's the original. And here's the reimagined. The hodgepodge of fragments lends a homespun quality to the music.
It's kind of inspired by both the idea of patchwork in general and this sort of imperfectness, like the idea of imperfectness. Right? Like we have all these things being patched together, and that composite adds up to what is you as a whole and like what is the fabric is as a whole. And thinking about the imperfectness of fabric in general, you can tear a fabric. Like it's not the most sturdy thing in the world or like strongest materials in the world. So this idea of splicing and recombining, kind of linking to this overall title with patchwork, and this idea of patching is really on a personal note. That's where my connection is, I would say.
Typically, Alvin enjoys composing light-hearted music that has a deeper message to convey, and audiences have picked up on that. He recalls a conversation with a colleague who commented,
"Your music is really funny and deadly serious at the same time." And I think that is like, if there is one compliment that I have to quote for the rest of my life, that would be my quote, is to come up with something that is very funny and serious at the same time.
But as it turns out, flannel flips that paradigm.
I think flannel is slightly more emotional or serious side, but I hope that in the seriousness, people could still find some lightheartedness in it.
We should note before we listen that flannel took some time to grow into its formal title.
I did not actually start with thinking about the fabric, but instead I had my pianist come into the piano room and we pressed record, and he practiced and rehearsed. And I was like, okay, I can just record it and see what I can do with that. And then I figured out in the software, just tried out different ways I can transform the sounds and maybe fragment the sounds, different fragments of the theme, and then put them back together. At one point, I came up with something that is like, you have this granulated texture that is slightly rough, but also not really like silky, still like smooth. Then also the musical fragments gave me this idea of, okay, something slightly like early winter, like a little bit needing a little bit of warmth. I just thought about flannel being this sort of fabric that is like cozy, warm, and also like silky, but also rough. And then starting from there, I use that concept back and then start to sequence the materials together to come up with the piece.
Having learned some of the inside scoop and having teased a few sections of flannel, let's finally hear how Alvin sequenced his musical gestures and sculpted the whole. We've been suspended in flannel, an atmospheric variation that Alvin Leung composed in collaboration with pianist Chun Xian Wei. Like the other variations in the Patchwork Suite, it was a modern reimagining of music by Enrique Granados. My sincere thanks to Alvin for his contribution and conversation on the Patchwork Suite. To learn more about the podcast or revisit the original Granados theme, queue up the Patchwork Suite Episode 1 and find all subsequent episodes online at wgte.org.